right, George, thank you so much for joining us. Today, we really just want to talk about roll-up strategies, right? We have a lot of members who are thinking about buying multiple businesses or wanting to do roll-ups in their industry. So I wanted to bring you in and really just tap into the expertise that you carry as they start their journeys. And so I know that you've been in leadership positions, you've founded and sold companies, you've helped grow businesses, and had, I believe, like a 10x exit, which I think is everyone's goal. You've consulted startups. And so I think now you focus on strategy and growth and corporate development. And so can you just maybe give a little bit of a background, since I did kind of high level, and then we'll talk a little bit about roll-ups.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks, Chelsea. My background is a really strange career. My first 8 years of my career were in investment banking, where I was doing mergers and acquisitions and capital raising in the retail industry. I was working in New York for Credit Suisse, and that's really where I sharpened my skills on mergers and acquisitions and first learned about roll-ups. And then the next chunk of the years in my career was as an entrepreneur, where I was, building venture capital-backed startups and learning how to scale early stage businesses. And what I learned in doing that was, learning and growing an early stage business is hard. There's many different ways to grow your business. And most entrepreneurs are doing it standalone. They're trying to think about it as, how do you use sales and marketing as a tool to grow your business? But they don't even think about mergers and acquisitions as a growth channel. And that's where I can come in and kind of help them think, have you thought about acquiring your competitor or acquiring a new product or acquiring new revenues or whatever it is, and potentially doing a roll-up in your space, because it might be easier to raise capital as a rolled up private equity backed company than it is as a piece of paper early stage venture capital. So that's sort of my background.
No, I love it. So just to start super basic, let's make sure everyone is aware, when we say roll-up, what do we mean?
Yeah, when we're talking roll-ups, we're talking about taking multiple businesses and putting them into one entity, one company that's all merged up together. So let's say there's 5 different competitors in an industry, and somebody reaches out to all 5 of those competitors and say, you're all small $5 million businesses, standalone. If we put you 5 businesses together, we'll have a $25 million company. And we'll have more buying power, we'll have more market share, we'll be able to scale more quickly, we'll have a leadership position in the industry and really tee ourselves up for long-term success. So it's really putting those multiple pieces of the puzzle together.
So when you think about roll-ups, I think that most people, at least most of our members, right, if they're thinking about doing roll-ups, they have some targets in mind. But what are the things that you want to think about when you're identifying kind of targets for a roll-up strategy?
Yeah, first it starts with a strategy, right? You need to know what you're trying to accomplish with this roll-up. Some roll-ups are very simple. You're trying to roll up revenues and market share and take out your competitors, right? That's one strategy. A second strategy would be, okay, maybe my business operates in the Northeast of the United States and I want to expand in different regions, and I'm growing into the Southeast or the Western United States. Sometimes you're adding skill sets into a business. Maybe you're a marketing driven organization and you're looking for a team that knows how to do sales, because you want to open up some bigger accounts with a sales team and you're acquiring a business for their sales expertise or their products. Maybe it's around products that they're in product number 1 and you're in product number 2, and there's a good opportunity to cross sell those 2 products and you're trying to add new products or new industries, same kind of thing.
So when they're doing roll-up strategies, I just realized, so a lot of roll-up strategies in the space that you're supporting, that's what we call proprietary outreach, right? They're like reaching out to people to see if they want to sell. And so that is a challenge for most of our members, is how do you find the information about whether or not those businesses are of a size that's even interesting to you, right? Because you don't know their financials because they're privately held companies. And so how do you decide who to target?
Yeah, a couple ways I do that. First of all, if let's say they're an online business, I'm trying to figure out how big they are, how many unique visitors are going to their website. There's some free tools like SimilarWeb, where you can type in the URL of the business and it'll estimate for you how much traffic is going to that website. You can compare that traffic to your own traffic to see, give you a rough sense to kind of how big their website is. If you're looking for revenues, I often go at Google. I'll usually type in the URL that I'm interested in plus the word revenue, And one of the first links there will be a business like Zoom Info or Hoover's or Dun& Bradstreet or whoever it is, where they will make a guess on what the revenues are for that business based on public filing. So, that is usually how I get a good ballpark. They're never 100% accurate, but they're close enough to know whether you're dealing with a huge company or a tiny company or somewhere in between.
So do you focus entirely on online businesses, or do you do brick and mortar as well?
Yeah, I mean, my expertise is across channels, across industries, across businesses. So it doesn't really matter to me when I'm working with a client. I've got clients that are both on the B2C consumer direct side, either they're offline or online businesses, or it could be B2B, right? It's some going after the enterprise or going after small and medium-sized businesses. It doesn't really matter what the industry is.
Okay, perfect. So you've identified the companies, right? And proprietary outreach is one of the most challenging, I think, for people to get their arms around. Like, what do I even say? Like, well, you want me to just reach out to people? What am I supposed to say? Like, sell me your business?
Yeah.
And so do you have coaching that you give to people around how best to open that conversation up with seller or with owners?
Yeah, there's two answers to that question. The first is, who are you calling into, right? You got to make sure you're calling the right person. So if you're trying to have a big strategic conversation, that most likely will be with the CEO of that business if it's a small business. If it's a bigger company, it might be with the head of corporate development or head of M&A or some other person inside the organization. Sometimes it's a CFO that you're trying to pitch some financial integrations with, and maybe the CFO will take your call, but you got to make sure you're calling into the right person. That's number one. Number two, you got to make sure you're hitting them with the right pitch. Oftentimes an entrepreneur makes a mistake where they're pitching their business and what makes them special. What the listener is listening for is, how can you help me, right? How is this going to help me improve my revenues? How is it going to help me lower my costs? How's it going to help me improve my user experience? So when you're making your pitch, you want to speak to the why you are calling and why it works for them, as opposed to how it works for you, right? So change your lens, right? Don't speak from your own vantage point. Speak based on the vantage point of the person you're speaking to.
I think that's an important thing to clarify. So our members, a lot of them are thinking about growing through acquisition, right? So they're doing a roll up, but it's really a growth through acquisition strategy, right? There is a different model of roll ups where owners will come together and basically agree to combine because it's in their shared interest for a bigger exit, right? Because like you said, joining forces of $4-5 million companies, it's a $20 million company, they're going to all get a higher multiple. And so in that scenario, I can see that conversation would very much need to center on like the them. But if they're thinking about buying a company and the owner is going to be out the door, right? Because they're acquiring that business and rolling it into their existing entity, how do you think they should position that differently?
That's an example. Let's use an industry that might have a bunch of older people that are looking to retire. They don't really care about the future. They just want to get an exit. They don't have a kid to hand off the business to, and they're just trying to get out. Well, that's part of the pitch, right? The pitch to that particular business is, we're your exit, right? You're trying to liquidate your business. We're interested in liquidating. We're trying to roll up the industry. If you're open to selling your company, we'd love to have that conversation with you. And then it turns into a conversation, a really easy conversation, because that listener wants something to happen. And then now it's a function of getting to a valuation that makes sense for both parties.
Well, I would think that it's interesting actually, as I think about kind of how I would sell myself to an owner in that situation. And a lot of times this is where earnouts come into play and things like that. But it's like, if I can convince you that I can grow this business and I'll share the growth with you if you kind of pick me, kind of a thing, I can see why that model tends to win out in this kind of, because I think what our members need to understand is roll-up strategies where you're just bringing people together to have a higher exit is a very different space than growing through acquisition, right? Growing your business through acquiring multiples is a roll-up strategy, but it's not the same as this, like somebody coming in and rolling these companies up, promising all these people a higher exit, which is typically what PE does, right? That's the PE model. And so any kind of guidance as far as our members aren't PE firms, right? They're individuals that are buying and wanting to grow their own portfolio. So I have had people come with this mindset is that they've gone to these owners and said, hey, let me acquire all of you. Because our members are buying in like the $1 to $5, $1 to $6 million range, right? So these are small firms. And so they'll say, I'm going to buy all of you, same pitch, right? You're going to get a higher multiple upon exit because I'm going to roll you all together. But do you have any advice as far as figuring out which of those strategies is the right strategy for our member? I know that's a hard question.
Well, there's two parts to that. The first part is the strategy that works for the buyer that's their buyer strategy. We're setting a strategy for this roll up overall, and we're trying to find targets that meet that particular criteria. The strategy for the seller is completely different, right? The seller, the first question we got to ask the seller is, what are you trying to accomplish? Are you happy in your business? Are you trying to grow your business? Do you want to become a bigger business? Or are you tired? You're, senior years of your living, you want to get out of the business and you want to exit? Do you want to have a stake in the going forward entity or not? So it's really fleshing out what their desires are at the target level and crafting your pitch in a way that it helps them solve their particular desire. So for example, if they're looking to exit and get out, well, great. You show up with a cash check, you buy them out and you're done. If they're looking to keep their job and they're looking to have a role in NewCo, well, great. Well, now the conversation moves into what are the roles and responsibilities? And if I'm going to be the CEO of the rolled up business as the buyer, what are we going to do with the old CEO of the seller? Are they going to be your head of product? Are they going to be your head of finance, your head of operations, or maybe head of strategy? If they want a going forward role, one, you got to want them. You got to have to think they bring value to the story. And if you do, come up with a mutually acceptable role that they'll be happy in. Because sometimes those individuals at the sellers are the most important people to keep involved in NewCo, because their whole client base is wrapped up in those relationships. And you don't want to lose the revenues as those relationships leave the company, right? So some of that kind of stuff.
So in those situations, how are you, like in that situation specifically, how would you finance the deal where you're keeping the owners involved, right? Because we know that takes SBA off the table.
Yeah, I mean, there's many ways to kind of finance a roll up, right? Finance number one is you may have cash on hand and you can use your own cash. Scenario number two is you go to the bank market, you go to the debt market and try to finance it with banks, maybe SBA loan or something else that's not available. Road number three would be a new equity partner that helps you fund your vision and fund your startup. So now you're talking about a private equity investor comes in and helps you put all these different businesses together. Or frankly, the most easy thing to do is a cashless transaction where, let's say you had two businesses that were each 5 million in revenue. And they want to get together and they're happy playing nice with each other and they're happy putting their businesses together to be part of a bigger entity. Well, great. We structure a merger agreement that says, okay, the shareholders from company one own 50% and the shareholders from company two own the other 50%. And together now we're going to do it together as one company, one ownership base. And now you got the $10 million in one company without a single penny trading hands. So there's ways to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's the trick, right? Is just understanding the strategy that's going to get you the outcome that you desire. And so I've had people kind of come and say, I've pitched this idea to a bunch of business owners. They're willing to do this. And then, I will have the role of integrating the companies together because they don't know how to do that. And so in that situation, if you're the acquisition entrepreneur, you've gotten these people to come together and do a 50-50, merger. Have you seen that happen? And if so, what was the acquisition entrepreneur, we'll call them, what was their kind of stake? What did they get out of it?
Well, I mean, let's think of it at the shareholder level, right? The shareholders of the buying company are always going to make a decision based on, is this deal going to be accretive to my earnings on an earnings per share basis, right? So let's say I have 1 million shares outstanding and, I'm worth $1 a share today. That's what my value is before I do a single acquisition. Well, if I'm now going to dilute my business with an additional 1 million shares outstanding for the new target company, is my value per share accretive worth more than $1? right? Did it go up to $1.50 or $2 by combining the earnings or the synergies of the merged companies? That's what you're always looking for at the shareholder level. If the transaction is dilutive, and now putting these two businesses is going to hurt your earnings per share, most likely you won't want to do that deal, or change the terms so you're not paying as much, so that you can at least keep your earnings per share consistent and flat, whether you're owning 100% of a million share business or 50% of a 2 million share business, you end up at the same place.
Mm-hmm. And so in those situations, you have two entities that have identified, and most of the time it's back office, right? That they can run the back office the same, right? Because back office operations, and by back office, I mean finance, HR, kind of the operational side, it can be run consistently across both businesses. And so just to be clear, when we talk about these transactions, it's streamlining those processes and eliminating that expense and redundancy that will then create the quote unquote synergies that justify the transaction. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, at the end of the day, I'll call the merged entity NewCo. NewCo needs a management team, and we need to define the roles and responsibilities and who's going to be our CEO, who's going to be our CFO, or head of operations, head of marketing, head of technology, whatever it is. Sometimes that senior team is already filled out before you even merged with anybody. And you got a really rock star team, and that's the team that's going to be managing all 10 businesses that get rolled up into NewCo, right? Sometimes you don't have the full team built out. And as you're acquiring the targets, maybe the individuals at the target companies can actually be elevated into management positions into NewCo. And now you've got new faces around the table that are helping you manage the combined business because they have a particular expertise that nobody around the table has, and it's an important expertise for the going forward strategy. So yeah, I think that the magic is figuring out as the buyer what your own skill sets are, where the holes are, where the business needs are, and make sure you put a team in place that can actually manage the going forward needs of that business. And maybe that's you, maybe it's somebody else, maybe it's a new hire, maybe it's somebody from the target company you just acquired. And then as the seller, you're trying to figure out, do I want to be part of that senior management team? And I think that's the right role for me. Or no, I don't think I want anything to do with that. I don't mind keeping my job. I'm fine being one of your sales guys in the trenches, but I don't want to be part of the executive team. You got to figure out what their needs are and put them in a role that they'll be successful with.
What do you think, as we talk about that, like, what are the critical success factors or the key traits of someone that's going to be successful at managing a roll up, right? So we talked about, like, is it you? Like, how do our members know if they have what it takes to effectively manage a roll up strategy?
Well, I mean, my first reaction to that is I wouldn't do any roll up unless you were surrounded by somebody that has M&A roll up experience, right? Either you as the CEO have done this before and you've seen it done in other industries, and now you're doing it a second time in a new industry and you can do it yourself. That's perfectly fine. If you have no experience with M&A and you need to find somebody that does, that can help you build the strategy, build the models, understand where the pain points are going to be, where the pitfalls are going to be to avoid them, how do you negotiate these deals, surround yourself by mergers and acquisitions advisors that, one, know how to get the deal done, and more importantly, know how to execute the deal once it's closed. And maybe it's a business broker or an M&A advisor on the first part of that. And maybe it's a business combination integration engineer that knows how to, lay out the next 100 days and how we're going to sequence what gets merged, when gets merged, and kind of build a plan from there.
And I think that's where people underestimate the difficulty with really merging back office things, or just operational stuff, right? Like, merging companies together is not simple. Like, it's like if you're trying to make a dish for dinner and you are using two recipes and you're just picking things, like, you're probably not going to get the dish you're going for, right? It's like, it's the same thing. And when you have to I feel like people approach this because the value is there. It's a strong business case, right? Like, most people will get excited at the idea of roll-ups because it's just something that's proven to be successful. But the success is in the implementation, and the implementation is complex. And so is there anything that you think is, do you think that small deals, so deals of $5 million companies with, 10 or less employees, are less complicated than a large, or I guess less risky, we'll say, than a larger deal?
Yeah, there's a wide range of answers to that. I'd say small businesses tend to be riskier just in nature than a larger company is, right? They're still figuring out their own businesses, right? They don't have their systems fully figured out. They don't have their processes fully figured out. And if your own house is on fire and you haven't put out the fires and solved your own problems, layering in the problems of another small business that have their own fires to put out is just making a bigger fire, right? So you got to make sure, one, your own house is in order before you start this process at all, and then two, make sure you got a strategy in place to identify where the fire points are on the target company, so that you can help them put their fires out with whatever solutions get put in place into NewCo.
Since some of the strategies are, I have this infrastructure in place, so I'm going to buy a roll up because I have this structure and these companies need structure. Just going to go in and I'm going to assert my structure. I'm going to buy 4 companies and I'm just going to say, this is the structure. How have you seen that done in the past, and how successful was that?
Yeah, I mean, that you've seen that lots of times in the services business. I've seen roll-ups with plumbers and electricians and HVAC guys, and pest control businesses I've seen where these are small little tiny businesses, right? They're maybe $1 million revenue companies, and some owner entrepreneur is running that business, and they're the ones providing the service, and they have nothing. They have no infrastructure. They got no system. They're booking stuff on their cell phones with a pad of paper and a whiteboard, right? So the pitch to those guys are, we're going to help professionalize your company. We're going to give you better tools, better systems. We're going to take over all the marketing. You never have to worry where all your customers are going to come from. All you need to do is continue to do the work that you love to do. You love painting. You want to be a painter? Great. We're going to focus you on being a great painter. Don't have to worry about being a businessman and being a marketer and driving new leads, because that's not really what you like to do. And we'll worry about that, right? We're going to put the big engine in place to kind of go out there and do the marketing and start doing the lead generation for you, and building the systems and doing the integration on the back end, that all the hardcore back office functions that you don't like to deal with is what we've built to make your life easier. So you're going to be more successful as part of our roll-up.
And so how do you pitch that scenario? And so you, as the acquisition entrepreneur, are you saying, here's a big company that I'm rolling people into, you can have 20% stake in a $20 million company instead of what you're doing now, and I'll take 10%? Like, give me an idea, or give our members an idea of what a structure would look like in that scenario.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll use an example. You got the 5 businesses that are all roughly the same size, right? You got $5 million companies are getting together, and they're going to aggregate 5 million. Well, each individual business is going to get a 20% stake in NewCo, right? So that's one way to do it, where you're just basically merging the businesses based on the relative revenues. Or if revenues isn't the right metric, you're going to merge it based on relative profits. Maybe one business has better margins or is more profitable than the others, and you're doing that same mathematics on relative profits instead of relative revenues. But that's sort of the mathematics. If the target wants to be part of NewCo and you are willing to dilute your own equity to take on that business, right? If you're not willing to take the dilution, because maybe it might be cheaper for you to pay cash for that business and take them out. Mm-hmm. Even if that individual is still working for you, they are not going to have an equity stake at all. They're just an employee at this point. And you use cash to buy them out at a low multiple, because the minute these 5 businesses are put together, your multiple is going to expand, and you're buying at 3x multiple, and the day the transactions close, you're worth 6x multiple just because you're that much bigger of a company.
And so in that scenario, that I'm trying to do the math for our members, right? So that they truly have an understanding of how this works, because that's likely the method that most of them are going to be wanting to use, right? There's 5 $1 million companies, they want to roll it into a $5 million company. In that scenario, the ownership of the company acquiring would be 100%, which would leave you nothing. So how do they maintain their ownership, right? Because if they're all splitting now 20% ownership, all of the owners for that example, we'll use they're all staying engaged, right? How are you involved? Or is it more like they're getting 15 and then you get 15?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to go back to that example with 5 businesses that each have a 20% stake. You as the buyer were one of those businesses. You went from owning 100% of $1 million business to 20% of a $5 million business. And if all the profits are the same on all those businesses, it was a neutral transaction. It wasn't accretive. It wasn't dilutive. There's power in scale. There's power in numbers. I want to be part of a bigger company, and I'm perfectly fine owning 20% of a $5 million company because I have made the decision that owning 20% of 5 million is equal to or better than owning 100% of $1 million. Yep. Right? That's where you're getting your value. So that's
perfect. No, that's perfect. And so the way that it works with our model, right, is like they would likely pay cash for the first business. And that the example that you gave is perfect, right? Like they pay cash for that one business, and then they take 100% ownership of that business, which then buys them into that 20% stake. And then they go and target 4 other providers in this space, and they make that deal of, hey, I want to do a roll up, and this is how I'm going to do it. No, it's beautiful. I think that'll make a lot of sense to our members, and finally give them something to keep in mind as far as a true model, right? Like a lot of things get talked about in theory, but nobody actually helps them understand, like, okay, but what does it actually look like? And so thank you for that, especially for bearing with me as I got us there. So
and there's a let's say you don't have a business. Let's say you didn't use cash to buy that first business. Let's say you're just a piece of paper idea at this point.
Right.
You could certainly pitch 5 different companies on this roll-up strategy and say, hey, listen, I'm the guy to pull this together. I've got the plan. I've got access to investors. I've got the experience with sales and marketing. I've got the best systems to kind of put these businesses together. I got experience with roll-ups and integration. I'm going to be the manager of this rolled up business, and you're going to trust me to kind of lead the company going forward. And in exchange for me bringing my leadership to the story, I'm going to get a 20% stake in NewCo. Right? So that 80% that's left gets divided up between the 5 companies, and you're taking like a management fee, right? You're taking a piece of the pie for bringing your value and expertise to improving all these different stories. And if the sellers don't like that, they say, listen, you're diluting me for nothing. I don't trust you. I have no experience with you. I don't think that's going to work. You could build an earnout model that says, okay, you're going to set aside 20% for me, and I'm going to earn it, right? And if you're $5 million in business today and $1 million in profits, I'm going to help. I'm going to prove my worth. I'm going to show you. I'm going to get this business up to 10 or 20 million in revenue, and I'm going to get it up to $2 or $4 million in profit. And as that revenues grows, as that profit grows, I'm getting 20% of everything I build. Right. And then now that's reasonable. Now they're not taking any risk as a seller. They're getting value for what they have today. And if you help create value for the organization, you get a cut of that value created.
And that's the model. Like I said, I've talked to people in the past that were doing this strategy, and that was always my question. Having managed integrations in the past, like there's a skill, like, right, to being able to do all of that. And I said, well, how are you convincing? Because like I convinced all these people to do this, and now I just need to go get the funding. And I'm like, how did you convince them that you could actually execute on an integration? He's like, well, I haven't quite sold them on that, but like, I'm like, well, how are you going to do it? Because that's a big task there, buddy.
Yeah, you shouldn't do a single deal until you figured out the integration plan.
So let's talk about that a little bit, right? So what are the big pitfalls when you're doing roll-up strategies that our members should think about?
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, what can't go wrong, right? There's many pitfalls along the way. I mean, we talked about, your own business and your early stage company. You got your own struggles and your own problems, and now you're taking on this struggles and fires of somebody else's business. So There's lots of areas for stuff to fall apart. I think the biggest issues fall around things like culture, right? Making sure that the two organizations are culturally fit with each other. If you got one culture as a bunch of positive minded, half full minded people, and the other business is a half negative, half empty kind of mindset, and you put those two together, they're going to drive each other absolutely crazy, right? So culturally, that's one major issue to worry about. I think making the wrong assumptions, right? You thought X, Y, or Z was going to happen at a certain level, and it doesn't happen at that level. It happens at half of the level. So the value that you thought you were going to give never fully materializes. And that kind of creates strains and problems, not only for the parties involved, but for the economics that you thought you were going to get out of the deal. So making wrong assumptions is always a hurdle. Losing key talent, right? I mean, let's say you put these businesses together and one of the employees doesn't like it or feel they're being bruised, or you got a new boss, they don't like their new boss, and that person walks out the door. Well, all those relationships just walked out the door with them, and you might lose revenues, right? That might be your head of sales in the acquired company, and he now walks out and it takes all his relationships with him, right? So there's so many opportunities for something to go wrong, and you just got to make sure you build a lot of cushions into the model.
No, and I think that's absolutely critical. Have you seen historically when people do roll-ups that they have somebody in there from a change management perspective?
Yeah, it's some consultant of some sort that can help you manage the process if you don't have the skill set yourself, right? If you're a proven executive that's got your own history with M&A and you've done these a few times before, well, you know exactly what you do because you lived through it. You know where all those pain points are. But typically a consultant can come in, they've got a list of, I don't know, 100 integration points, and they just run through a process, and they check everything off their box. Did we integrate all our financial systems? Did we integrate all of our insurance policies? Did we integrate all the the marketing activities and the branding and all the stuff that we got to think about? You just work your checklist and you build a logical calendar for it. And the most important thing is to not merge things too soon. Okay. And what I mean by that is if there's 100 things on the checklist, start with the easy stuff. Don't start with the hard stuff, right? It's easy to kind of merge a recruiter, right? I'm going to have one central recruiter hiring people for both companies. Okay, there's no harm done. That recruiter is going to do no harm in whether they're hiring for company one or company two. The minute you start to say, okay, I'm going to rebrand this business, and I'm putting a new brand on the company, and now I need expertise in rebranding and doing the hard stuff, that I've saved for the later steps. Don't do that out of the gate. So you want to do no harm in, let's say, the first 6 to 12 months. You want to let you want to let the dust settle. You want to get the people used to working with each other. You don't want to put any revenues at risk. You just want to keep it business as usual for some period of time. Then you start with the back office functions, finance, accounting, systems, that kind of stuff. Those will be the first things you tackle. And then the last thing you tackle, the longer term stuff, is the front end, right? The sales and marketing and branding and where revenues will be put at risk.
Yeah, and I really love where you went with culture, actually, because people don't think about it's your people are the biggest risk, and everyone knows that. Losing people in transactions is the biggest risk because the institutional knowledge that can be lost, right? But people don't realize that culture is defined by how you operate. And so if that company, let's just say the owner is very hands-off and that everybody has autonomy and does whatever the hell they want, right? And they do it well because you've got historical performance that caused you to want to buy the company, right? The other company or the processes and things that you want to put in place are not that, right? You want structure, you want hierarchy, you want organization, you want people to follow a process. That is going to change their experience working, which in turn is going to create dissonance for them, which in turn is going to create flight risk. And so when we talk about culture and culture fit, it's just so important that people are mindful, which is what I keep hearing you say, right? It's you need to be very intentional with, make sure that you're planning for things as you're doing them. Because I feel and everybody will say in every article you read, right, that cultural fit is planned for and underestimated, and it's the biggest challenge. And so I think that when people are like, well, I have a process, I'm just going to assert this process on the company because they need it and they'll want it. Be very cognizant of anything you do. I love that you say do no harm. Like everybody laughs at me, but I had to take an oath to do no harm when I graduated with my master's degree, and I stick with that, right? That's part of the reason why I love transactions, is because I really want to help them be less impactful to people. And so when you're implementing these changes, anything that impacts their day-to-day operations has the potential to do harm to them, even if you don't think it's harm, right? And so you just want to be very mindful about how your choices are impacting everyone's day-to-day life, because that's going to be disruptive to the culture that is there.
Yeah, for sure.
I'll get off my soapbox now.
No, but everybody should be listening to you. I couldn't have said it any better than you just did. So that's perfect.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about kind of one question that I thought was probably kind of important for our members who are probably going to do more of a stair step kind of roll up strategy. Although not all, right? There are some that are going to buy 5 companies and just roll them up. What are some things that they need to be thinking about during due diligence? If they're doing a roll up strategy, right? We all know that due diligence isn't on its own, right? It's the first step of the process, and it should all be connected, which is often not, but it all needs to be connected, right, to closing. And so, and post-close integration. And so what should they be thinking about as they're evaluating these deals if they're considering doing roll-up strategies?
Yeah, a couple key areas there. First, there's business due diligence, understanding their business. What are their products? What are their services? How do they drive revenues? And what's their model? And do a SWOT analysis on their business, right? What's their strengths? What's their weaknesses? What's their opportunities? And what's their threats, right? You want to make sure you got a good understanding of the business. That's the step one. Step two is doing financial due diligence, right? Dissecting their numbers, making sure you got a clear understanding of the financial statements and where their debts are and what liabilities are out there, both known on balance sheet or off balance sheet. You want to make sure you know where the risks are. So you have a clear understanding on, what is at play and where the financials are going to look like together. And there's going to be a little bit of modeling exercise on how do you put companies A financials together with companies B's financials, and what does that new co look like? So there's that whole financial due diligence. Then you have the legal due diligence, which is studying their contracts, their liabilities, any lawsuits, any claims, anything that kind of touch the legal, trademark infringement, copyright. You want to make sure you've done all your legal due diligence to make sure you checked off all those boxes. And those are sort of the 3 big areas. You're doing due diligence on the business, the financials, and the legal. But you need a good advisor that has done that before, right? There are so. I always say that a good lawyer really earns their stripes during the bad times, right? Because when the shit hits the fan and this deal is falling apart, the better written contract is the one that's going to protect you, right? And oftentimes entrepreneurs don't realize what they need to put in those contracts. They're not thinking about all the 100 things that could go wrong, where an M&A lawyer that has done this for a living can put in the protections for those 100 things that can go wrong. So you've got it well documented in case something does go wrong, you can point to the contract and how to resolve it. So get a good M&A lawyer. Don't try to do this by yourself.
No, I think that's a really good point. And we talk a lot about, vetting your lenders, vetting your, lawyers, and making sure that they've done it. We just had a deal fall apart a couple of months ago. And when I asked, how did you pick the lender? And they went with a lender that was in our network, but not necessarily like it was the lender, but not the person, right? That we were familiar with. And so it's so hard to make sure that you're picking the right person, but that right person will really be important to the success of your transaction. And so I felt awful, right, that they had gone with a trusted name of the entity, but like not everybody's created equal. And so make sure that you're asking questions about all of your partners' experience doing transactions, their experience in the industry, their, how they've handled when things go sideways. Because you need people that you can talk to openly and honestly, and that understand transactions. You don't really want anyone that's cutting their teeth on your deal.
Yeah, for sure.
Unless you've done it before and you feel like you don't actually need them and you're trying to save money, then by all means, I guess. But I wouldn't do it. I-
It's what I like to think in the legal world is it's okay to make mistakes on certain subjects, right? If you made a mistake during the business formation and you really want to pivot from being a corporation to an LLC, okay, we can fix that, right? You can't make mistakes in M&A, right? There's just no room for mistakes. You got to get this right? So you need a really good, proven M&A lawyer that has cut their teeth 100 times before you because they've seen it all,
right.
and they've edited their templates to address for it.
And that's it, right? You want somebody that's seen things and can, that's one of the reasons why I brought in one of our advisors. Our most recent advisor that was added in February is the first technical advisor we brought in. And he's seen hundreds of deals. And I did that for a reason. I'm like, I need someone that has seen hundreds of deals that can say like, yeah, this is normal, or nope, that's not normal. Because there's so much power in that, right? I know we're almost at time, so I want to be respectful of your time. Is there anything that you want to share kind of in closing about like the most important thing that they need to think about when it comes to roll-ups?
Well, we kind of chatted about a little bit earlier is this concept of multiple expansion the bigger a company gets. So the way to think about that is let's say you have a business with under $1 million in profits. Well, you can typically buy those companies in the 2 or 3 times EBITDA range, right? That's the low end multiple. If you have a business that's doing over $10 million in profits, consistent annual profits, that business might trade hands at 8 to 10 times cash flow, or even more, depending on who the buyer is, right? So think about what I just said. As if the goal is to get your business from 5 million to 50 million, right? Your multiples are going to expand from 3x to 10x, right? So as you're buying all these businesses at 3, you're immediately going to end up with a business worth 10. And you're gonna create value by not doing a single thing other than putting these businesses together, right? Now the key of the merger is don't screw it up, right?
I was gonna say, you're not doing anything except for a million things.
Right, exactly, right. So that's going back to the do no harm and make sure you can protect and preserve the revenues that are being created. Because if let's say you put 2 businesses together and $1 million in revenues in one and $1 million in revenues in the second, and let's say something goes wrong and the $1 million in revenues just evaporated. And now you diluted your shareholders by 50% and you still have the same $1 million that you started with. That's a disaster right there. So yeah, do no harm is the key.
No, I so appreciate your time. Do you work one-on-one with clients?
Yeah, of course I do. So if any of the listeners of this have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. You can reach out to me at george@redrocketvc.com. And check out our services at redrocketvc.com.
And so I'll create a profile that you can find under service providers that will overview your services. They can contact you directly from that. It'll also link to this talk. Anything else that you want to share before we kind of wrap it up?
No, this is awesome. This was a lot of fun, Chelsea. Thanks for the invite.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. It's a topic that I really wanted our members to hear more about, and it was perfect. So thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Sounds good.